Hello, this is Daniel King with my play of the day for round 6 of the Wijk aan Zee tournament. And I've chosen the game Carlsen against Sokolov. No surprise there. Let's go straight into the game. It's quite a long game, so I'm going to have to rush through a lot of the moves, but I'll stop at some of the critical moments anyway and discuss them. So it's a Spanish. And Ivan Sokolov actually specialises in the black side of the Spanish, so Carlsen, of course, will have been prepared for this opening. And this variation is called the so-called Archangel variation, playing the bishop to b7, and it can lead to very sharp positions indeed if white plays moves like d4 or c3 and d4. But Carlsen, as is quite typical for him, avoided any major theoretical discussion and played a very pragmatic move, d3. Now this looks very modest indeed. Normally in the Spanish you want to roll forward in the centre with c3 and d4. But it does make a lot of sense because this bishop now bites on this e4 pawn. So effectively it's blocked out of the game for the moment. And that's what Carlsen plays on for most of this game actually. That he has better placed mind pieces, as we'll see. Okay, Sokolov continued to play actively, bishop to c5. a4, okay, this is very typical, of course. You're trying to exploit the fact that this pawn has advanced and perhaps weaken it, or perhaps gain control of the a file, or gain control of some squares on the queen side. Okay, a typical move for the Spanish. It also means the bishop can drop back to a2 if necessary, so you preserve the bishop in some variations. Okay, black castles. Now here's the first moment where Carlsen's strategy is revealed. The normal move in this position is to play knight c3. This has been seen, well, hundreds of times in professional chess. And this is not a bad continuation for white, but Sokolov would have been very well rehearsed in this position. Carlsen chose something a little bit different. He played the bishop to g5, of course pinning the knight to the queen. Very normal kind of strategy. Makes a lot of sense when the bishop has moved to c5 instead of square e7, which would of course break the pin. And Sokolov played h6 and the bishop dropped back to h4. Of course you don't take on f6. There would be no point in giving up the bishop here in that position. But this is a very provocative strategy from Carlsen, playing the bishop here. Of course it tempts black into making this very aggressive move g5. And over the next few moves you can see from Sokolov that he's hesitating, should he play this move or not. There are pros and cons to playing g5, as we're about to find out. So at this point Sokolov was already consuming a lot of time over his moves. He clearly wasn't sure which strategy to play. And now queen e7. And this next moment is curious. You know, knight d2 looks like a normal move, but again Carlsen played in a very provocative way. He played knight to a3. Okay, hitting the pawn on b5, that all looks fine, but the point is that Sokolov now played knight a5, bishop dropped back, and now b4. There's no point in the knight going to c4, that gets exchanged and the pawns are doubled, it's horrible. So the knight had to come back to b1. Now this looks dreadful for white, you know, losing so much time. But in fact, Carlsen has gained something by this little manoeuvre. He's lost time, but he's gained some control over the c4 square. The pawn no longer stands on b5. But also this knight is actually very poorly placed on a5. And as we'll see, it doesn't move for the rest of the game. So often in the Spanish, you'll find a knight on a5 that's just kind of stuck there out of play, and that's what happens in this game as well. But still, it's very provocative of Carlsen to play like this, because it does waste so much time in shuffling the knight to a3 and back again. Okay, well, finally Sokolov couldn't resist the temptation to advance this pawn, and the bishop came back to g3. The king doesn't seem to be in any danger at all after this advance. So, what's the downside of g5? Well, the point is, it's this square that's been weakened. If Carlsen can land a knight on f5, then it can't be driven away by a pawn, and, well, it hits, well, sort of some rather sensitive points in Black's camp. But at the moment, there's no prospect of getting a knight there. But, well, let's see what happens. Okay, knight h5, good follow-up. It means that sometimes you can knock out the two bishops with knight takes bishop. So far things looking okay for Black. But let's see what happens. Carlsen plays just very calmly, very carefully, rook e1. This might be preparing this maneuver, and okay, this typical Spanish maneuver and getting the knight to f5, but let's see. Okay, Sokolov exchanges, whips off the bishop. And round about here, I think this is actually one of the critical moments in the game. White's position doesn't look too threatening. Black's position, on the surface of it, looks absolutely fine. The two bishops seem, well, they're often a great asset. So what should Black be playing here? I think Sokolov got it wrong around here. He drifted. He didn't find a very convincing plan. But it's not easy. I mean, one thing is I'd like to bring this knight back into play from a5. The problem is now White's knight takes over, and the knight still isn't very well placed here. And if it goes back again, then possibly knight a5, maybe knight e3 into here. So that's not very good. What about f5? That's the kind of move I would love to play to try and open up a file here, and you can see that would open up the bishops. Problem is, after taking, then d4 is a very attractive move. Of course, there's a pin on the e file, the bishop comes into play, doesn't look too good, and particularly with the knight out of play on a5, miles from the king side, doesn't look great. I think the move I like here is to play bishop c8. As I said before, the bishop's really doing nothing on this diagonal. So just to bring the bishop round to e6, and maybe at some point to advance with h5 on the king side. To me that makes much more sense. But instead Sokolov drifted. He played queen f6. Okay, there's a threat to play g4 to drive the knight away to hit f2, but okay, that's defended against very easily, parried very easily by queen e2. And now Sokolov moved the rooks to the b file and exchanged all the rooks, and this I really don't like, because rooks and bishops work very well together. And he's just exchanged off all the rooks. And now, well, you can see Carlsen has had time to maneuver the right knight around to e3, and he's getting closer to the f5 square. Okay, let's press on, and now Carlsen assumes the initiative. I didn't really like this next move of Sokolov's, because then the knights really do get into f5. I mean, maybe c6 is stronger, but even here, well, White can play g4 and start building up, but still, after Black played g4, then White's knights come in, and, well, you can see he's managed to establish this knight on the dream square f5. Of course, if it's exchanged off, then the next knight takes its place. So somehow by stealth, Carlsen has reached his dream position. He's achieved the knight on f5, he's building up in the centre very nicely. This knight is locked out of play on a5. Suddenly a line opens up to the pawn on a6, and it's clear that White has the advantage. Black is just very passive here. The only question is, can he hold out? I like Carlsen's play over the next few moves. He doesn't attempt to do too much. He's just manoeuvring, hoping that Black will somehow get frustrated defending this passive position, or get worried about some kind of ghost of a threat. And commits himself in some way, and that's what happens here. I mean, this manoeuvre, this king march into the middle, looks odd to me. The king, I think, well, as we'll see, it comes under fire. It's actually not exactly clear what Carlsen is doing here. If black waited, then it's still very difficult for white to make progress. I mean, I think one possible idea is to shuffle the bishop back to this diagonal to hit the a6 pawn and then bring the queen back. I'm just playing passively for black just to show you what white's strategy would be, and then to target the a6 pawn. I think that's certainly one way. In the meantime, black can do very little in this position. Okay, but Sokolov, short of time, getting frustrated, nervy, defending this passive position, broke out with d5. Of course, if this is taken, then bishop takes knight. But Carlsen just nudged the bishop back to defend e4, and everything is fine. I mean, possibly Sokolov missed this quiet move when he played d5. He saw his chance to break free, but as is so very often, that actually well, wrecks black's position, actually. Okay, so now there's a threat to take on d5. Really, black has to exchange these pawns in the middle of the board, but of course that brings white's pieces into strong positions. The bishop is very strong, looking at c6. Queen c5. White is just crawling in here. You know, obviously the queen threatens to go to a7 to hit these two, and it's very nasty. Also, look at the difference between the two kings. White's king completely safe behind these pawns on the king's side. Black's king exposed in the middle of the board. At some point earlier there was a temptation maybe to play f3 and king f2, but Carlsen again played very practically and kept his king safe. And now it's just a case of opening up the position to get to the king. Okay, this is what happened, and well, white's pieces are just so beautifully placed here. And the presence of bishops of opposite colour means that white's attack is especially lethal, because you can never exchange off this attacking piece, and white, well, you can see, every picture tells a story. White's pieces are all on white squares, they can't be challenged. And there are so many targets here. The king is obviously a target, a6 is still a target, and these pawns as well. That's too much for black to hold on to, and in the meantime, look at the knight here. It has no sensible move, it's completely dominated. Okay, let's zip to the end of the game. Black took a pawn, but I mean, it's all in vain, because the king is getting cut to shreds here. After the game, Carlsen said, well, you know, black could have struggled on with queen d4 in this position, and that is what's better than the game move, but here this is still fatal. White is mopping up pawns, and the king is still in desperate trouble. For example, here white's initiative is rampant, and you can hack pawns off. The king is still vulnerable, and as ever, no counterplay against white's king. Okay, the game finished bishop d8, and in this position a really neat finish actually from Carlsen. He spent precisely 9 seconds over bishop f5 check and 22 seconds over this final move, queen c8. When he sees a finish, boom, he's deadly, he's in there. And here black resigned. Why? Because there's no defence to bishop d7 check. Well, let me just show that. Random move for black, knight b3, bishop d7, the queen takes, and then knight f6, forks king and queen. Beautiful game by Carlsen, rather typical of his style. You know, in the days of Kasparov used to overwhelm his opponents very often with his opening preparation, and then the force of his attacking play on top of that. Carlsen plays very pragmatically in the opening and just gets a playable position, and then He slowly presses and outplays his opponents. It gives the lie to the view that professional chess these days is all about opening preparation. Carlsen proves otherwise. It's all about, as ever, being just the best and the strongest player on the board. Thanks very much for watching.